The Way of Truth and the Way of Opinion by Parmenides of Elea, circa 515 BC to 456 BC. A work of metaphysics first transcribed in the 5th century BC. The principal ideas are that reality is a solid, homogeneous sphere. All appearances of change and motion are illusory. Whatever exists could not come from nothing. It must then have come from what exists. But if the existence can come only from the existent, there is no beginning to what exists. Reality is eternal and indestructible. Since the material of the universe consists of its sensible qualities, and since to change would involve the non-existence of qualities, which are eternal and indestructible, change is impossible. Parmenides, it appears, began his philosophical career as a Pythagorean, but when still a young man, he attained the insight that reality consists of a solid, homogeneous sphere, the appearances of diversity and change being altogether illusory. He set out this extraordinary doctrine in a poem in hexameter verses consisting of a proem, a section, The Way of Truth, expounding and defending the theory of the sphere, and a section, The Way of Opinion, in which he dealt with current, probably Pythagorean, scientific theories. The proem and the important The Way of Truth have been preserved substantially intact, but only a few fragments of the Way of Opinion remain. The proem is an elaborate allegorical description of Parmenides' journey into heaven. In a chariot drawn by immortal mares, he is conducted upward by the daughters of the sun, who bring him to the gates of the ways of night and day. The keys to which severely chastising justice holds. At the entreaties of the maidens, Justice opens the portals, revealing the goddess, which could be Justice, who addresses Parmenides. O youth, who come to our mansion in the company of immortal charioteers, welcome. It was no evil fate, but right and justice that set you to travel on this way, far indeed from the path trodden by men. Meet it is that you should inquire into all things, the unshaking heart of well-rounded truth, as well as the opinions of mortals in which is no true confidence at all. Yet none the less you shall learn all things, even how seeming things, all passing through each, must really be. The goddess warns Parmenides against relying on the senses for knowledge of reality. Keep your thought away from this way of inquiry, and by no means let much tried custom force you this way. To ply the unseeing eye and the ringing ear and the tongue. The tongue considered as the organ of taste there, not of speech. She goes on, rather judge by reason the much disputed proof which I expound. End quote. The much disputed proof is strictly a priori, depending altogether on the law of identity. And I quote, well then I shall tell you, and do you attend and listen to my word, what are the only ways of inquiry there are to think of. The first, that it is, and that it is impossible for it not to be, in the way of conviction, for it follows truth. The other, that it is not, and that it must needs not be, that I tell you is a path that none can learn of at all. For you could not perceive what is not. That is impossible, nor even think of it, for it is the same thing that can be thought and that can be. End quote. The goddess expressions are puzzling, for it is not English or Greek either to simply say it is. We want to know what the it stands for, and if it is, say, a cabbage, still the expression a cabbage is makes no sense. A cabbage is what? Nevertheless, the sense of the passage is unmistakable. If there is something real, and there is, then whatever characters it has just those characters and none others. A is A. It is impossible to think of A's not being A, for to say that A is not A would be in effect to say that the thing having the character C does not have the character C, and this would amount to saying that something and immediately retracting it, so that altogether nothing was said. It is in this sense that it is the same thing that can be thought and that can be. The goddess did not mean, of course, that there must be mermaids in the ocean, because we can think of them. She meant that reality and thought must alike be non-contradictory. All this is perhaps innocent enough, but the goddess is going to use the principle thus laid down as the weapon to destroy belief in the reality of the world revealed by the senses. The first step is to draw the corollary, for this shall never be proved that what is not is, for it is not possible for what is nothing to be. The thought is that the word nothing means that which is not. Consequently, any sentence having the word nothing as its subject and is as its verb must be contradictory and not to be thought of. Having established this, it is easy for the goddess to prove that what is uncreated and indestructible. For what birth of it will you seek out? In what way and from what source its increase? I forbid you to say or to think that it came from what is not, for how what is not could be is neither speakable nor thinkable. She says, the argument implied is a simple dilemma. If there is an origin of what is, that origin must be either what is or what is not, but it cannot be what is not, for if so, the contradictory sentence, what is not is the origin of what is, would be true, which is absurd. And of course, to say that the origin of what is what is, while in a sense true, is so only trivially. Therefore, what is uncreated. The goddess advances another argument to prove the same conclusion. And I quote, and if it came from nothing, what need could have made it arise later rather than sooner? End quote. This is really an argument from an assumed causal principle. Even if the objection be waived that what is not is unthinkable, mere nothingness or negation could not, by definition, afford any reason or cause why something, if it were to originate out of it, should suddenly appear at one time rather than another. But without such a reason, nothing could appear at any time. Hence, if there ever were a time at which there was just nothing at all, then there never could be anything at any other time. This argument was attractive to many subsequent philosophers, being urged by Sir Thomas Aquinas and Thomas Hobbes, amongst others. A similar argument, which is not given, would show that annihilation is also possible. Thus is generation extinguished and destruction not to be heard of. So far the conclusions reached are only such as were agreed to by all Greek philosophers, both before and after Parmenides. Nothing comes from nothing, and nothing disappears into nothing. But, and I quote, nor is it divisible, since it is all alike, and there is no more of it in one place than in another to hinder it from holding together, nor less of it, but it is completely filled with what is, wherefore it is wholly continuous, for what is in contact with what is. It is immovable in the bonds of mighty change, not starting, not stopping, since generation and destruction have been banished afar, driven back by true conviction. Wherefore all these things are but names which mortals have given, believing them to be true. Generation and destruction, being and not being, change of place and alteration of bright colour. End quote. These astounding conclusions are drawn as corollaries without further argument. Motion was supposed to be impossible, because if anything were to move, it would have to move into empty space. But since empty space would be what is not, there cannot be any empty space. As for alteration of bright colour or other qualitative change, this could not take place either, for if an apple previously green were to become red, this would entail the disappearance of the greenness into nothing, and the appearance of redness from nothing, both equally impossible because contradictory. The last surprise the goddess has for Parmenides is this, and I quote, "It abides the same, remaining in the same place by itself, thus it stays, rooted to the spot. For mighty necessity keeps it in the bonds of a limit, which shuts it in round about. For this reason it is not right that what is should be without an end, for it is not wanting. If it were, there would be need of everything. Since then it has an outermost boundary, it is limited from every side, like the mass of a well-rounded sphere, extending equally from the centre in every direction." End quote. This emphatic assertion of a spatial limit to what is perhaps the hardest of all for us to absorb, since we immediately are led to ask, in Parmenidean fashion, what is outside it? If more of what is, then there is no limit after all. But if what is outside of what is what is not, then it cannot exist as a limit. And indeed, Parmenides' follower Melissus of Samos ventured to correct the master on this point. He asserted that what is spatially infinite. Parmenides' thought seems to have been that infinity, being without end, entails incompleteness, hence could not be predicated of what is, which is perfect, and indeed it was characteristic of Greek thought to prefer the tiny to the vast. But this at most extenuates Parmenides without acquitting him of manifest inconsistency. "Here shall I close my trustworthy reasoning and thinking for you about the truth," says the goddess. "Henceforward learn the beliefs of mortals, giving ear to the deceptive order of my words." After this unpromising beginning, there follows an account of the nature of things, more in keeping with the general tenor of early Greek thought. We learned, for instance, that Parmenides understood that the moon shines by light borrowed from the sun, but the fragments of this part of the poem are too few for us to reconstruct the system at all. The purpose of including it seems to have been to forestall derisive criticism of Parmenides as ignorant of the science of his day. I quote, "I am telling you everything about his plausible cosmology so that you may not be surprised in insight by any mortal." End quote. To the modern student, perhaps the most puzzling thing about Parmenides is the fact that his successors, including especially Plato, had so much reverence for him and took his argument so seriously. Of course, no serious thinker in the 5th century BC could dismiss Parmenides' conclusions merely on the grounds that they were incompatible with observed fact, For philosophy, which was still a new enterprise, consisted in an investigation of the world by reason, and if in general the senses provided the data for the inquiry, no philosopher considered himself bound to conclude that things are in all respects as they appear to be. If the senses declared things to be thus and so, but reason indicated that they were otherwise, it was not by any means unheard of to dismiss the observations as deceptive. In throwing out all observation, Parmenides only carried to an extreme a pre-existing practice. In the second place, Parmenides, the founder of formal logic, simply deduced the logical conclusion of the assumptions agreed on by his predecessors. These assumptions were: first, monism. The stuff, whether water, the boundless, mist or fire, of which all things are made, is at the base of one kind only. Second, conservation of stuff. This stuff as such is eternal, being neither created nor destroyed, neither augmented nor diminished. Fourth, a refusal to distinguish, or rather the non-occurrence of the idea of distinguishing, between what we should call the qualities of things and the things qualified. Thus heat and brightness were not thought of as properties of a fire substance in itself, inaccessible to observation. Heat and brightness literally constituted fire. For lack of a better word, we may call this assumption phenomenalism. And fourth, the reality of change. Once these assumptions are made explicit, Parmenides' philosophy becomes in a certain way obvious. If the stuff of things is ungenerated and indestructible, and if that stuff consists of insensible qualities, then it is out of the question for it to change. For to say that it changes is precisely to say that it has a property at one time that it lacks at another, a conclusion that contradicts assumptions 2 and 3. Thus, what is must be at least frozen, but furthermore, there cannot be any diversity in it if the premise of monism is taken seriously. Parmenides' argument against motion on the ground that motion requires empty space, and empty space would be what is not and therefore non-existent, is an obvious sophism. Oddly though, his successors, Empedocles and Anaxagoras, deferred to it and denied the possibility of a vacuum. They attempted to make reason square with observation by giving up the postulate of monism in favour of 6 kinds of stuff, in the case of Empedocles, or as many stuffs as there are perceived differences, in the case of Anaxagoras, and they tried to account for motion in a plenum as displacement, illustrated by a fish swimming in a jar full of water, failing to see that the argument that empty space would be nothing is independent of Parmenides' main contentions, and that change is inconsistent with the postulations of conservation and phenomenalism. They exposed themselves to the Parmenidean rebuttal of Melissus, who pointed out that if there were a many, these would have to be of the same kind as I say that the one is. For if there is earth and water, and air and iron, and gold and fire, and if one thing is living and another dead, and if things are black and white, and all that men say they really are, if that is so, and if we see and hear aright, each one of these must be such as we first decided, and they cannot be changed or altered, but each must be just as it is. In fact, if Parmenides' conclusions are to be escaped without abandoning either conservation or logic, it is necessary, besides clearing up the quibble about empty and nothing, to do 2 things. First, to distinguish between a thing and its properties, that is, to abandon phenomenalism. Second, To distinguish within properties between qualities and relations, F. H. Bradley's Appearance Reality showed, as late as 1893, how if the reality of relations is denied, if relations are conceived as qualities or predicates of the things related, then a Parmenidean view of reality is inescapable. Of the ancients, Democritus, Plato, and Aristotle were the only philosophers who displayed some grasp of Parmenides' essential points and tried to come to grips with them. It is doubtful whether any of them was altogether successful. It should not be thought, however, that Parmenides' philosophy is free of internal problems. Besides the difficulty of the outermost boundary, the most obvious one is this: it is not sufficient to reject sense experience or anything else as illusion unless one can at least show the possibility of explaining, consistently with one's general position, how the illusion occurs. But such a possibility seems to be ruled out in Parmenides' system, for if we assume that in reality there exists nothing but a homogeneous, rigid sphere, it seems that there cannot be any illusions at all, since in order for there to be an illusion, there must really be a mind that is deceived, and the mind is by its very nature something that is changing, or at least implies change. It thinks now one thought, now another. There is a further paradox that Parmenides in effect reduced one of his premises to absurdity. As a matter of strict logic, all that Parmenides proved was that the four assumptions listed above are incompatible. The argument of itself did not show that the postulate of change was the one to be rejected. Parmenides evidently chose to deny it because of his logically independent argument for the impossibility of void, and perhaps also on religious grounds. Now, since there is no inconsistency in assuming at once modism, conservation, and change, as the atomists were to show, Parmenides' reasoning would have been invalid without the premise of phenomenalism. Yet this premise seems incompatible with his conclusion that what is not at all what we perceive. Perhaps, however, Parmenides interpreted the third premise as implying only that what is must have, or be some kind of quality capable of entering into some kind of consciousness. The property in question might have been just awareness itself. The fact that Melissus argued explicitly that the one could not suffer pain suggests that he thought it could suffer something, in other words, be somehow conscious. This lends some slight support to the conjecture that Parmenides' sphere, though undeniably a body, was also endowed with non-discursive consciousness, whatever that might be. If so, then there is warrant for thinking of Parmenides as the father of idealism. And we all know who the greatest of all idealists is, of course. Hence my channel.